Welcome back to the online lecture series organized by Department of English, KKM College Jamui, and YouTube channel English Literature Briefs. Today we are back with again two speakers who will talk on poetry. And today the first speaker is Mr. Atanu Paul, who is presently as an assistant professor and head at Department of English, JMS College Munger, which is a constituent unit of Munger University Munger. Besides, he is also a doctoral candidate in the Department of English and Foreign Languages, Guru Ghasidas Vishwavidyalaya, Bilaspur, Chhattisgarh. He has delivered many invited lectures and presented papers in national and international seminars and conferences. He has, to his credit, some publications in national and international journals as well. So I invite Atanu for his talk on Hopkins. The topic of his talk is Hopkins as a precursor of modern poetry, a select study. Over to you, Atanu.
Hello. Very good morning, one and all, whosoever are present on the other ends. And I take immense pleasure, and at the same time, it's my gratitude. I express my gratitude towards the chairperson or principal of KKM College Jamui and our two active conveners, Dr. Anindya Sundar Pole and Dr. Shaifi Danish. And special mention should be made of Dr. Risha Sinha also for her zeal in English literature briefs. So without bothering further, I want to say that already it has been announced. Today's topic is Hopkins as a precursor of modern poetry. Hopkins is such a personality that without Hopkins, there can be no syllabus or syllabi in any university. Generally, in UG course and also in PG course, Hopkins is prescribed. So I have been taught by my teachers about Hopkins, his poetry. So special mention should be made of Hopkins in various regards. I would like to start that. Okay, we have some PPT presentation. It can facilitate you all so that my voice is not so well today. Yeah. So as you can see that the title is very much mentioned, and regarding Hopkins, we will start rather from some later year, a market year after his death, or rather the year, the posthumous year. It has been said that the most important date in Jeremy Hopkins' career was 1918. 29 years later, or 29 years after his death, for it was then that the first publication of his poems made them accessible to the world of readers. During his lifetime, he did not enjoy the popularity. During his lifetime, these remarkable poems, which were published in 1918, most of them celebrating the wonders of God's creation or God's grandeur, had been known only to a small circle of friends, including his literary executor, his friend Robert Bridges, who waited until 1918 before releasing them to a publisher. Partly because his work was first made public in a 20th century volume, but especially because of his striking experiments in meter and in diction. Hopkins was widely hailed as a pioneering figure of modern literature. Miraculously, he is unconnected with his fellow Victorian poets or Victorian counterparts who uh, never appeared so prominently in publications of 1920s or 1930s. Uh, and this way of classifying and or evaluating his writing, these actually persist for long and long. So you can see there, I have mentioned clearly that 1918, this is the most important year in the career of Gerard Manley Hopkins. So I repeat. So in a way, we have begun a year, posthumous year, in speaking of or in speaking about Hopkins. So this is somewhat exceptional. I thought that it is convenient, we should begin this way because he himself was an exceptional figure. So we should begin this way. And we will now try to lay emphasis on some publication history. And afterwards that, we will of course touch upon his personal or biographical note. Richard Watson Dixon and Coventry Patmore, and of course Robert Bridges. These are the close friends or close circle whom or in which Hopkins sent his poetry for criticism, encouragement, and understanding. Robert Bridges, the most important of the three, was extremely discouraging. Whenever he shared his poems, he generally sounded discouraging. He felt that the sprung rhythm of the Wreck of Deutschland was presumptuous jugglery. In 1915, Bridges printed 7 pieces in his Spirit of Man. The publication was The Spirit of Man, including the first stanza of The Wreck of the Deutschland. We know that The Wreck of the Deutschland it's a very long poem consisting of, I think, 35 stanzas. The success but he published this time only one stanza, single stanza. The success and sale of this anthology, both in England and in America, led him in 1918 to publish his friend's work. So this way, in his preface to the small volume, Bridges, who was then the poet laureate, probably from 1913 or 14, he was poet laureate. He wrote in hope that the readers would search out the rare beauties that distinguish his work. So he used the word rare, but it had both connotations, both good and bad. Hopkins had written to Bridges concerning his poetry beforehand, means when he was alive. He wrote to Bridges, if you do not like it, I should read out. If you do not like it, it is because there is something you have not seen and I see. And if the whole world agreed to condemn it or see nothing in it, I should only tell them to take a generation and come to me again. So this was his saying. And after the first edition was printed, it was the Imagists. We know the Imagist movement happened in England and in America also. It was the Imagists and writers of free verse or verse libra who were among the few that welcomed the new poetry. The review of those days were mixed. Critics praised and blamed. And they also praised and blamed Bridges also for his part in the publication. Some felt that the poetry was too theological, the poetry of Hopkins was too theological, and some thought that life was too short to try to understand such complex sprung rhythm, that the metrical effects were unrewarding. and that the poems produced the effect almost of idiocy. But others are also there who are praising like anything. They called Hopkins's poetry most sensitive and the poet without equal as a metrist. And during the 1920s, I am actually speaking at large the publication part because it is very important. During the 1920s, some of the poetry was reprinted in anthologies of contemporary poetry. And the most important influential criticism Hopkins started with an article in 1926, we know, by I.A. Richards in Dial, and with the publication of also Seven Types of Ambiguity by William Emerson in 1930. So in 1930, another edition came out, and the Times Literary Supplement called Hopkins a true genius, one of the major poets, and the most original or the poets of the 19th century. Sir Herbert Reed in 1933 wrote that, I have the quotation, nothing could have made Hopkins' poetry popular in his day. It was necessary that it should first be absorbed by the sensibility of new generation of poets. No influence whatsoever is so potent for the future of English poetry. C.D. Lewis calls Sprangdem one of the best gifts to posterity, and Hopkins a true revolutionary poet. And the list goes on and on with critics like F.R. Davis, Matthiesen, and so on and so forth. In 1936, a substantial selection of his poems laid off the Faber Book of Modern Verse, first edition by the editor Michael Roberts, one of the most influential anthologies of the century. And this anthology featured poets such as Auden, Dylan Thomas, T.S. Eliot, the only one whose selections occupy more pages than those allotted to Hopkins. Means next to T.S. Eliot, the pages more in number were allotted to Hopkins. And the first four editions of the Norton Anthology of English Literature, starting from 1962 onwards, grouped Hopkins with these 20th century poets. So I am stressing again and again on the fact that he is more contemporary with the modern poets. Now, we'd like to give a brief sketch on Hopkins's personal life or biographical history. Yeah, as you see there, Hopkins was born near London into a large, cultivated, and artistic middle-class family of Anglicans in comfortable circumstances. From the time he was a youngster, Hopkins was a curious mixture, a strange admixture of aesthete and ascetic. As a child, some episodes or anecdotes actually they go round and round that as a child he practiced salt imposed tests of willpower by denying himself such things that he will not take salt or liquids for varying lengths of time. So for a couple of days, I was reading. So these are so interesting. He continued these practices as a 19-year-old undergraduate at Oxford. At times, he forbade himself all puddings, tea, the comfort of armchairs also. So rigorous practice he sometimes went through or passed through. After a brilliant career at Highgate School, he entered Oxford in 1863. Mark the year 1863, where he was exposed to a variety of Victorian ways of thinking, both secular and religious. Among the influential leaders at Oxford was then the towering figure, of course, Matthew Arnold, professor of poetry. But more important for Hopkins was his tutor, Walter Pater, an aesthetician whose emphasis on the intense apprehension of sensuous beauty struck a responsive chord in Hopkins. While at Oxford, Hopkins also met or was influenced by some other figures like Jowett, Ruskin, William Morris, uh, and of course, two leaders of the Anglo-Catholic movement, Pusey and H.P. Leedon. During this time, he started to keep two diaries, one as secular and the other as spiritual record. At Oxford, he was also exposed to the broad church theology of one of the tutors at the college, uh, Benjamin Jowett. Uh, uh, but so he was exposed to this person. We know the broad church movement, low church, and high church movement there. But Hopkins became increasingly attracted first to the high church movement, represented at Oxford by Edward Pusey, and then to Roman Catholicism. Profoundly influenced by John Henry Newman's conversion to Rome and by subsequent conversion with Newman, Hopkins entered the Roman Catholic Church in 1866. So this very year also is very much important. He entered the Roman Catholic Church in 1866. The estrangement from his family that resulted in his conversion was very painful for him, and so he described somewhere that the letters from his family were so terrible, and this alienation somehow or other heightened. This alienation was heightened by his decision not only to become a Roman Catholic but to become a priest, and in particular a Jesuit priest. For many Victorian Protestants regarded that time the Jesuit order with a special distrust, but he chose that path. For the rest of his life, Hopkins served as a priest and teacher in various places, among them Oxford, Liverpool, and Lancashire. In 1884, he was appointed professor of classics at University College in Dublin. At school and at Oxford in the early 1860s, Hopkins already wrote some poems in the vein of John Keats. He burned, most surprisingly, he burned most of these early writings after his conversion, for he believed that his vocation must require renouncing such personal fame or satisfaction. Only after his superiors in the church encouraged him to do so again, he did resume writing poetry. Yet, during the 7 years of silence, as his later show, he had been thinking about experimenting with what he called a new rhythm. So, the intervening years, the silent years, actually he was thinking of something. And the sprung rhythm, that title, of course, the coinage, that is, of course, his brainchild. The result came in 1876 when his rhapsodic lyric narrative, The Wreck of the Deutschland, got published. It was written fully. The style of the poem was so distinctive that he tried to get it published, that the editor of the Jesuit magazine to which he had submitted it dared not print it. And during the remaining 14 years of his life, because he died in 1889. So during the remaining 14 years of his life, Hopkins wrote poems but seldom submitted them for publication, because at the very first time he was rebuffed. And he always was convinced that the poetic fame was incompatible with his religious vocation, and also he had some fear that readers would be discouraged by his eccentricity of his work. It is required that we should make some emphasis on sprung rhythm. So, sprung rhythm, it is highlighted in the next slide. Hello. I don't know if you can see the next slide or not. Yeah, there is the sprung rhythm. I have randomly mentioned some quotations from Hopkins, because Hopkins, when I was reading for 2 days, I was astonished to see that Hopkins wrote or retorted again and again back to his friends with some lines, with some commentaries, with some opinions, with some views about his own writing, about his peculiar meter, rhythm, whatever. He explains at large, and these are of course they have got published in various publications. So I found them, and whatever I found to be suitable, I just placed here, so that I want to show them to you. I don't want to tell many things, but I want to show them, because Hopkins already he explained about these things. So you can see here, sprung rhythm is measured by feet or from 1 to 4 syllables regularly, and for particular effects on any number of weak or slack syllables may be used. It has one stress which falls on the only syllable. If there is only one, or if there are more than scanning or above on the first, and so gives rise to 4 sorts of feet. Sorry, actually it is not clearly visible to me. That's why the problem is monosyllabic and the so-called accentual trochee. So I will explain it later. So the lines goes thus: the sprung rhythm is measured by feet or from 1 to 4 syllables regularly, and for particular effects on any number of weak or slack syllables may be used. So the stress or the stressed syllable is there, but the unstressed syllables, they are not following any norms or any regularity. They may vary from 1 to 4. Concerning the nature and history of sprung rhythm, Hopkins goes on to say, sprung rhythm is the most natural of things, for it is the rhythm of common speech and of written prose. When rhythm is perceived in them, it is the rhythm of all but the most monotonously regular music, so that in the words of choruses and refrains, and in songs written closely to music, it arises. It is found in nursery rhymes, weather songs, or so on. It arises in common verse when reversed or counterpointed for the same reason. So, as we find here, Hopkins practices are rigidly disciplined, highly intellectual or mathematical system of expression. When he tries to explain his poetry, he is often contradictory, obscure, unsound. He again and again he explains this sprung rhythm to his friends in his letters to Bridges and Robert Bridges and Dixon, and it may help to clarify what Hopkins is getting at, to quote from his letters to Dixon, who also had trouble in understanding this new method. Hopkins says, "I had long had haunting my ear the echo of new rhythm, which now I realized on paper. To speak shortly, it consists in scanning by accents or stresses alone, without any account of the number of syllables." So again and again he is mentioning the same thing, show that a food may be one strong syllable or it may be many light and one strong. I do not say the idea is altogether new. There are hints of it in music, in nursery rhyme, and in popular jingles. In the posts themselves, and since then, I have seen it talked about as a thing possible in critics. Here are instances. He mentioned some instances. The continued slide, it can be shown. There I have mentioned two instances. The next slide, please. Yeah, there you can see these very references actually Hopkins mentions, because in nursery rhymes and in popular jingles we find these lines: ding dong bell pushes in the well, and the lines goes, next lines are as like, who put her in, little Johnny thin, who pulled her out, little Johnny stout. So this is from the nursery rhyme. And another example is there: Margaret, are you grieving over Golden Globe unliving? So the marks are there. Okay, you can very well see the accentuated and the unaccentuated marks. So if we sum up about sprung rhythm, the distinguishing features of sprung rhythm are then that stresses may occur together without intermediate unstressed syllables. The rhythm is to be measured in feet of 1 to 4 syllables, as we have found in the quotation. Though the unstressed syllables may be unlimited, and the stress falls on the only syllable of a one syllable word. If it is monosyllabic word, there must be the stress generally. Of course, we have to abide by the rules, preposition, conjunction. Those rules are there. Those who are acquainted with the rules, okay, you can very much understand this. Or on the first syllable of a polysyllabic word. So if it is polysyllabic word, on the first syllable the very stress is there, but the other syllable maybe 1 to 4, they may go unstressed. In order to ensure the success of his particular metrical system, Hopkins found that the use of alliteration, assonance, internal rhyme, and word repetitions were essential, but not as decorative elements, but to be employed to please, to surprise. What I mean, these alliteration, assonance, internal rhyme, word repetition, these are very much there in Hopkins as an integral part, essential element of the new prosody. Alliteration is functional rather than ornamental. So this is all about sprung rhythm. Now we should be clear of some of the other terms like inscape and instress. In the next slide, you can find, okay, there you can find inscape and instress. Actually, inscape and instress are words found very frequently in Hopkins' writings. They reveal his preoccupation with the essence, the uniqueness, the individuality of things. So what is inscape? The sense is that each object is contemplated separately for its own individuating characteristics. Objects have not only a physical life of their own, as we find, as we see, but also an emotional or spiritual life of their own. Not only an objective appearance, but an inner life capable of exerting an influence on others. So objects are not merely objects, they have some inner essence. The term inscape is described in a letter to Dixon, as you find there. as the very soul of art. In a letter to Bridges, Hopkins is more specific. Design, pattern, or what I am in the habit of calling inscape is what I above all aim at in poetry. But Hopkins uses the term also as a ontological secret behind the object, the inner form of the object, as I repeat. He recognized in Duns Scotus a spiritual kinship. Actually, he said that the very idea he took up from Duns Scotus, and with Duns Scotus he felt a spiritual kinship and uses it to express relationship. The bond this way created between an object, the viewer, and God results in an inscape. Instance is used less frequently than inscape, of course, and is nowhere explicitly clarified. Instance apparently means the intrinsic force necessary to the perfection of being. Or if we use instance as a verb, we must say that we realize or we bring to a realization. Instance is that stress or energy of being by which all things are upheld and strive after continued existence. Throughout his journal, Hopkins sees and describes inscape, but instance seems to produce an indescribable emotional reaction. Essentially, instance is a straining, striving towards perfection or toward God. So, this way, we have somehow understood the concept of inscape and instance. So, these two terms are basic to Hopkins's way of thinking, rather than to his actual poetic work, but to his to understand Hopkins as a poet. They exerted an influence over everything he wrote and thought and everything he did. Now, we would like to move forward to his poetic feats or poetical achievements. Next slide, please. Yeah. So, I have mentioned here some poems one by one. I don't know how much time we will find to discuss on, but to give, I try to give or provide you with a holistic view of poetic career, or to relate the poems that this poem belongs to this page or this poem belongs to that page. So you can, so that you can relate or you can locate the poems in Hopkins. So we must say that Hopkins was both a traditionalist and a revolutionary. He revived in his poetry the ancient traditions of Christianity, of language, of technique, and gave them new life, new lease of life, and new iota of meaning. Many of his sonnets, which seem strange according to the author, are only imitations in English of the original Petrarchan sonnet. The early poetry of Hopkins, the poetry which survived burning, as I mentioned, shows the influence of Keats and of the pre-Raphaelites. The next group of poems, also among his earliest, begin to show not only Hopkins' religious inclination, because as you have already, as you have been acquainted this time also, the poems have a marked influence or touch of religious inclination, but also that characteristic of his of prohibiting to himself those things which delight him. Okay, because he was practicing the ascetic things. The conflict between the dreamer on the one hand and the churchman on the other becomes increasingly apparent. So in this way, habit of perfection, these poems, these these are the poems which Hopkins experimented with for the first time with stresses. And after 7 years of priestly training and meditation, Hopkins, at the age of 31, broke his self-imposed silence, and at the request of a superior, some senior one, he wrote his major work, The Wreck of the Deutschland. And it is a very much long poem, The Wreck of the Deutschland. It is about or it commemorates the death of 5 Franciscan nuns who perished aboard the Deutschland when the ship went aground on some Kentish coast. The Wreck of the Deutschland opened new channels of prosody because it is that long poem in which he used lavishly the sprung rhythm. It was in every way a mature piece of work embodying the full range of Hopkins's metrical and linguistic techniques. And although there is much more to be said of the Wreck of the Deutschland, I have chosen that some shorter or some later poems will be more profitable in this short compass of time. From 1875 onwards, when the Deutschland was already written, and until the end of 1878, Hopkins completed some 16 poems. In them, the same sacramental view of nature is expressed, and the same view upheld that God must, with his creatures, make an union, or it is the duty of the creatures to feel God in everything. The same technical devices are developed or deployed or elaborated. A religious experience of beauty is the central motif of all the poems, and all the poems speak of or sing of the thing that all beauty leads to God. All the senses are directed to an appreciation of His beauty. During this period, he wrote God's Grandeur, and in God's Grandeur, as you find, actually, the critical appreciation or the summarization of the poems are not possible here in the paucity of time. As you find in these lines, generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's marge and shares man's meal. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being sow. The world, which is charged with grandeur of God, actually, that world actually goes unnoticed. The squalor and misery accompanying material progress results in the loss of vital sensation. That very phrase is there being short, but there is hope, for nature is never Spain. And so the lines go, because the holy ghost over the bent world broods with one breast and with bright wings. This sonnet reveals many examples of the poet's techniques. In developing the sonnet form, he was always trying new methods, shifting the emphasis, lengthening or shortening the line, expanding or tightening the musical and semantic phrase, and experimenting with new rhythmic devices. God's Grandeur, though in standard rhythm, is sometimes counterpointed, that is, the accent beats are reversed in 2 feet running. Hopkins produced many of his surprising effects with his use of rests or pause or caesura. He did not hesitate to break the rhythm of a line at its most sensitive position. And of course, other poems are also there: The Starlit Night, Spring, The Lantern, Out of Doors, and Pied Beauty. So since the Pied Beauty is in your syllabus, so I should touch upon that poem also. So in Pied Beauty, the text is there. It is there in the next slide. Yeah. As Pied Beauty, very famous poem. I think everyone is familiar with this very poem. Hopkins has a different form. It is the known things. Those who have been initiated with English literature, you must know that Hopkins has a different form in this poem. He says every poem must have inscape and should be in design. So the plan was somewhat something else, and that every poem also should be distinct. The distinct design makes a poem a poem. For that reason, he uses the rhythm as sprung rhythm, and somewhere there is internal rhyme, which is and somewhere uh, through this design of the poem, actually the design of the universe also is correspondent. Uh, and Hopkins more importantly uses Catal sonnet as an exceptional sonnet where Catal means curtailed, where he minimizes the traditional form of a sonnet by reducing the 8 lines in six and 6 lines into four and a half. So the octave general sonnet having 8 lines, those 8 lines have been reduced to six, and the sextet part that has been reduced to four and a half. Multiplicity is there in the pattern, and somewhere there is alliteration. And the repetitions of the sounds in the poem through the words like dappled, stippled, tackled, pickled, adagel reinforces the theme of the poem by interweaving the diverse things of the nature created by the god into a beautiful and comprehensible whole. Uh, Next, we should, time is short, we should move on to the next poem, Windover. A very important poem of all the poems written in 1877. Hopkins selected the Windover as his best, and he dedicated it to Christ. It tells of the unseen war in the breast of a humble servant of God. It describes Hopkins' spiritual conflict and his reconciliation in Christ. In the poem, the speaker recounts the awe-inspiring sight of a kestrel or the windhover soaring through the air in search of prey. The speaker is deeply moved by the bird's aerial skill or aerial acrobats, its ability to both hover in stillness and swoop down with speed, and sees the bird this way as an expression of the beauty and majesty of God's creation. The poem's octave part, or the first 8 lines, concentrates primarily on the bird, while the sextet, the second and final section of the poem, discusses the creature in a wider religious context. The speaker ultimately stresses that such beauty is in fact no wonder, because all of God's creation is divinely beautiful. This poem follows the pattern of so many of Hopkins' sonnets, in that a sensuous experience or description leads to a set of moral reflection. Part of the beauty of the poem lies in the way Hopkins integrates his masterful description of a bird's physical feat with an account of his own heart's response at the end of the first stanza. However, the sextet has puzzled many readers because it seems to diverge so widely from the material introduced in the octave, and as you can find, especially at line number 9, at ninth line, the poem shifts into the present tense, away from the recollection of the bird. The horse and the rider metaphor with which Hopkins depicted the windhover's motion now give way to the phrase "my chevalier," a traditional medieval image of Christ as a knight on horseback, to which the poem's subtitle, or better we call the dedication, gives the reader a clue. The transition between octave and sestet comes with the statement in lines 9 to 11 that the natural, the brute beauty of the bird in flight is but a spark in comparison with the glory of Christ, whose grandeur and spiritual power are a billion times told lovelier, more dangerous. The confusing grammatical structures and sentence order in this sonnet contribute to its difficulty, but they also represent a masterful use of language. Hopkins blends and confuses adjectives, verbs, and subjects in order to echo his theme of smooth meaning, the meaning that birds perfect immersion in the air, and the fact that his self and his action are inseparable. So it can be noted that how important the suffix ing part ing ending is to the poem's rhyme scheme. It occurs in verbs, adjectives, and nouns, linking the different parts of the sentences together in an intense unity. A great number of verbs are packed into a short space of lines, as Hopkins tried to nail down with as much descriptive precision as possible the exact character of the bird's motion. So we'll now speak something about terrible sonnets. Between 1879 and the time Hopkins entered his tertianship again in 1881, he composed 16 additional poems. These are not centrally concerned with a sacramental view of nature, nor do they chant the praises of the Lord as freely as we have seen in previous poems. This group of poems is concerned primarily with man and with Hopkins's experience as a priest. A greater awareness and tenderness is apparent in such poems as Felix Rendall, Brothers, Spring and Fall, and the Wedding March, Dan Scott's Oxford, and the Leaden Echo and the Golden Echo. The poems born out of Hopkins's suffering and desolation are closely associated with his ill health, uncongenial surroundings, and heavy duties, and with a period of mental depression and spiritual aridity. We can find this description. Written in blood, the terrible sonnets include the following poems, as Robert Bridges mentioned them or numbered them, like 40, 41, 44, 45, 46, 47, 58, 51, and 69. So in this order, the poem, the numbering 40, that is the carrion comfort. But due to the paucity of time, I think that this poem cannot be discussed at this very moment. So we should move on to the next part, most important part. Please skip this terrible sonnet, carrion comfort, because it is going to be feasible or possible this time. Some greater okay, this slide is very much important. We should lay stress on this. Hopkins' influences on modern poetry. The modern poetry. What are the main features of modern poetry? Because I think everyone is conversant with the features of modern poetry, that poetry is objective or impersonal. Poetry is not spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, as Wordsworth stated. Rather, it is not an expression of personality. Rather, it is an escape from personality. Poetry should express unified sensibility, in intellect and emotion, association of sensibility, combined as in Donne and other metaphysical poets. Poetry should be symbolized or indirect in statement, but its images should be precise and clear-cut without any vagueness. And poetry should be free from the shackles of metrical regularity. Any metrical regularity or discipline should not be strictly followed. The poet is free to write as he chooses, to adapt his verse to the rhythm of his thought. So, when in an age when Tennyson, Browning, and Swinburne experimented with various rhythmic forms in English poetry, in addition to the the poets I mentioned, Rossetti, Francis Thompson, actually many of them also innovative, experimental. But in English poetry, Hopkins's contribution in innovation or in experimentation in verse, of course, is indeed remarkable. One said that, one reviewer said that, I have the quotation here, but no poet writing today feels that he can learn technical secrets from these poets, means the Tennyson, Swinburne, whereas Hopkins is full of strange powers and unexhausted technical powers which he feels he must assimilate and possess. In his love of God, England, and natural beauty, Hopkins was as Victorian as any poet of his generation. But because of his technical originality, technical novelty, because he had technical novelty, he had so much to offer to the modern poets. And because he had so much to offer to the modern poets, he is equally at home in the 20th century. Hailed at first by the imagists, he has continued to grow in stature more and more. The extent of his influence may be gauged by examining the work of his contemporaries and those who followed him. It is not surprising that the close association of Hopkins and Bridges would have led to similar experimentations. In the matter of rhythm, Hopkins was the leading spirit and Bridges somewhat unwilling follower. If Hopkins is the bold adventurer, Robert Bridges is the cautious, doubting, careful refiner. But in the long run, Bridges' two poems, Robert Bridges' two poems, are Passerby and London Snow, are instances where he deftly handled the new rhythm, this sprung rhythm, though they lack in the vigor, vitality, or urgency as we find in Hopkins' poetry. Between the publication of Bridges' shorter poems, which were published in 1890, and Hopkins' poem in 1918, the imagists formulated new poetic goals. We know the free verse developed naturally from the work of Whitman and Ezra Pound, in America, Samuel. Two of they were there, but the imagist school, it is the best means of producing new rhythms to express new moods. The free verse, it seemed to the imagist school that the free verse is the best means of producing new rhythms to express new moods. But there are important difference between free verse or verse river and sprung rhythm, as enunciated by Hopkins. Hopkins's rhythm is meter. The lines are measured and the verse patterns are regular. Ezra Pound, whose first poetry appeared in 1909, believed that not enough attention was given to the rhythmic quality of poetry as one who helped in the revival of all English alliterative verse. Ezra Pound experiments with sprung rhythm in his Seafarer, a poem. That poem was published in Ripostes in 1912, and also in other poems in the Return and the Alchemist. So I am mentioning this that many poems tried their hands, copying Hopkins. Herbert Reed makes an interesting observation when he points out the similarity of Hopkins and James Joyce in their use of contracted similes or metaphors and in the new combinations they made of existing words. He might also have added that both extracted parallel meanings from words, particularly homophones, both James Joyce and Hopkins, much before it. Both employed archaic words such as Inuit in place of conscience. Both enjoyed puns and word games, and both poets too wrote for the ear rather than the eye. And this way, we find his influences, rapid influences, sweeping influences on modern poetry. So now, in the conclusion part, if we have to conclude, I have quoted here one excerpt or one quotation from T.S. Eliot's Tradition and Individual Talent. Actually, Eliot says there, if we approach a poet without prejudice, we shall often find that not only the best, but the most individual parts of his works may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. And he also continues, and I do not mean the impressionable period of adolescence, but the period of full maturity. So, this is so true, as I have mentioned, this is so true of the modern poets in whom Hopkins left an indelible mark or impression. Because in other poets, we feel the presence, accepted or unaccepted presence of Hopkins. In 1932, Munger published an anthology, and there he wrote some lines in as dedication, and I think this is the fitting lines to conclude with. And the line goes thus: to the memory of Gerard Manley Hopkins, the influence of whose work will be seen in some, if not all. So here I close. Hello. Some problem persist. Yeah, you're to
Thank you so
Hello,
much.
sir. I have finished.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Certain bits of disruption coming. Okay. Awaj is okay.
Thank
Now,
you so much, Atanu, sir. It was an extremely well organized talk. You have radiantly introduced the complication public history of Hopkins and his contemporaries. It was extremely in terms of understanding the philosophy of his poetry, I must say. Also, you have talked about Hopkins' biographical detail, especially his experience as a priest, and tried to connect it with his works. Altogether, you have created a very pertinent background for the poems. The poems chosen for the talk are also very well explained. I especially want to thank you for selecting poems related to the UG syllabus of our university. You have also introduced the concept of rhythm and exemplified it beautifully with citing lines from Hopkins. You have also talked about important terms like in scale, in stress, and Gartle sonnets. You have comprehensively analyzed the poems, especially God's grandeur or Pied Beauty or Windover. I your effort. Now, as I could see, there are many questions posted by the students lined up for your response. So, without much delay, let me put the questions in front of your screen.
okay. I would like to take up the questions, of course, from the students, but I would be interested in taking up the general questions. Okay, because that is the scope. Because I am not actually a scholar on Hopkins, but for 2 days I managed to accumulate or gather together some things or jotted down some things. Okay.
Okay. So this is your first question.
Okay, I can see here. My question, Kundan Thakur, he said, my question is there. Question: is there similarity between Shakespeare's sonnets and Hopkins' poetry versification? Which perspective to included of the nature? Uh, okay, actually, okay, a good question, of course, but the question actually is bifurcated in two parts. The first part, it actually says some technical aspects, but in the later half, which perspective to include of the nature. Uh, uh, of course, in Hopkins, there are the greatest strains of narrating nature. That is there, nature or natural beauty or natural aspects or natural creatures. Everything is actually thought of with the grandeur of God. So in everything, he finds, as I mentioned in the concept of inscape and stress, that he finds that everything, be it living or non-living, animate or inanimate, everything they have their individuality. The object and the objectness of one object is different from the objectness of another object. So this way he treated every natural things, and he sees that in in speaking of these two objects, say uh, some inherent energy is there that makes these objects vibrant, and that makes these objects unified by some creation, by some energy, and that he calls instinct. So in every poem, time and again, just I think it would be better if we prepare ourselves beforehand with the concept of inscape and stress, then it will be very much uh, easier to us to understand the description of nature by Hopkins or the implications of Hopkins. But in Shakespeare, the natures are there, nature is there, the descriptions of nature is there, of course, but that is just for comparison. Because the sonnets, Shakespearean sonnets are classified in three groups or three classes or three heads. So to suit the comparison, to drive home the ideas, he describes those things, but not as lavishly as Hopkins does. So I think, okay. Sir, how Brishti Mukherjee, she poses some questions. Sir, how can we interpret the role of nature in Hopkins's poetry? How is it coexisted with his religious beliefs? Okay, her identity she has disclosed. Okay, I think just if in the previous question I have narrated, or I have tried to touch upon that thing, because in Hopkins's poetry, the not simply delineation of nature for the delineation's sake that is there. Everything is charged with everything with some grandeur of God. So that concept is there. Means inscape is there, and instance that can be uh, comprehended, that can be understood with rapt attention, with some insight also, with some contemplation. I can mention you one thing, Brishti, that just to get the idea in my own way. You have read, I think, Wordsworth, a poem, Tintin Abbey. So poets are there expressing the things in different ways, and there Wordsworth says the emotion and spirit impels everything. The lines go like that. So the while delineating the pantheistic philosophy, that everything is charged with some spirit of God, because Wordsworth is actually deifying nature. But Hopkins, in another aspect, he sees nature, he sees every animate and inanimate, living, non-living beings, that they are charged with some grandeur of God, the majesty of God, and so religious beliefs, they very much coexist with every natural delineation. Devashish Mitra, what are your views on the changes sprung within ushered in the history of poetic techniques in English literature? Good question. Actually, I try to put emphasis this aspect in appreciating or in understanding Hopkins, because Hopkins he has confessed that sprung rhythm is not something new, something the total thing, total brainchild of his. He never claims that. He says that it was there in the Anglo-Saxon period, in the Old English, old poetry, but from the age of Shakespeare or Elizabethan age, it was not in vogue. So it was there some, and it was also in oral forms, in nursery rhymes, as I mentioned one or two beats. It was there, but that very term was not there. The terminology, the sprung rhythm, it came with Hopkins. It is his brainchild. He calls absolutely he can be credited with this very term, the sprung rhythm. Why sprung? The spring means to jump. Thus, regarding or in counting the stress syllables, the one stress syllable may be succeeded by another stress syllable, and at times it cannot be succeeded by stress syllable, and it can be succeeded by unstressed syllable, and those unstressed syllables, they vary in numbers, maybe as we mentioned 1 to 4. So regarding the count of the unstressed syllables, so there is no prescriptive norm. So this is the pattern, and how he used in the history of poetic techniques in English literature. Actually, I mentioned that very part, that in the literary scenario, because Hopkins died in 1889, but we know very much that 1819 onwards there was a movement, decadent movement, very short-lived, in stark reaction against that Victorian complacency or the Victorian monotonous musicality. Decadent movement, it was very short-lived, and after the decadent movement there was Georgian poetry. So the prime figure of Georgian poetry was, of course, Robert Bridges. The Testament of Beauty comes later, but other poems are there, and W.H. Davies, Houseman, Edward Thomas, Walter de la Mare, they are the practitioners of Georgian poetry. But somehow the imagism, the connotations or the practice of imagism, they were creeping in. Okay, and with imagism, there came the verse libra or free verse. Okay, so there that was there, but it sprung rhythm because it was not any official, or it was not something much used by other practitioners. So it was solely restricted to Hopkins until 1918. When it came to the notice, it came to the limelight, then people thought of using it also. So they are actually inspired. So side by side verse libra or free verse, there was sprung rhythm, as I mentioned in towards the end of my slide. Actually I mentioned 2 or 3 various poets. Numbers, the list goes on and on. They tried their hand. What is sprung rhythm? Okay, they tried their hand, but not to the stature of Hopkins. So it was there, and you can find, I think, in almost every notable modern poets, you can find sprung rhythm, but they have used limitedly. Okay. Ashwarya Mehta, poets like Tennyson, Browning, and Swinburne, they all experimented with various rhythmic forms in poetry, but why do we still consider Hopkins's contribution extremely remarkable? Actually, I think that very thing for the time being, I mentioned towards the closure, closure of that slide, where in Hopkins's influence on modern poetry. Tennyson, Browning, Swinburne, okay, they were there. Tennyson, what thematically he strikes that note, keynote, Victorian compromise. Browning is there with the optimistic note. Swinburne is there, so the pre-Raphaelite brotherhood, Swinburne or other poets, they are there. So they were, as I mentioned, they were not innovative. They are not innovative or experimental with their techniques. Like Browning, he experimented with that technique, dramatic monologue. The dramatic monologue was Robert Browning's or his forte, we can say. But he entered into the dark psyche, shadowy secrecies, crevices of the human mind. So thematic, and the techniques are somewhat different techniques, as you mentioned, Browning. Tennyson, he discussed nature very lucidly, very pictorial qualities are there. Musicality is there, of course, but Hopkins's musicality, it's some totally different thing. It exists as he claims in nursery rhymes. It is very much. It was actually overlooked, or we have never noticed this thing. We means the poets or the practitioners that time, but he made something new, and that way throughout my lecture I just mentioned that thing, that since this was something new, since this was not something officiated, so this very thing, for this very thing, he never got his poems published. And Robert Bridges, in whom he confided in everything, okay, he confided Robert Bridges, other circles, they are also skeptic. If we publish these poems with strong rhythm, so people will be dissatisfied. People will be vehemently critical, assiduous. Okay, they will not take this thing properly. So Robert Bridges himself was dissuading him. Maybe he was his greatest friend, but he was dissuading, and so Robert Bridges, so as he himself was convinced of this capability of this particular technique, it took time that he himself was convinced. So when he found the time that this very time is suitable, when already Georgian poetry came, and when already imagism creeps in, he finds that this very time, this is the suitable time. And of course, he was the poet laureate. So some position matters, the position of profit. So then he tried to get those poems published. Otherwise, we also think, the critics think, that maybe if in other times, if it got published, maybe two kinds of result. Either it could be accepted or it could be rejected.
This is your last question, Atanu.
Okay. Ujjal Chobe. Hello, sir. This is okay. This is one question. If God is the ultimate good and God is the past change, then why does Hopkins praise things that change and might therefore seem impure? I don't get the implication of the word praise. Why does Hopkins praise things that change and might therefore seem impure? Just one thing I will say, Ujjal, that all the things, as you have mentioned, maybe in Pied Beauty or in other poems, there are actually things, though everything, the mutable. The mutability is the law of nature, and everything is in flux. And amidst flux, God himself is the fixity. So he is praising God that you are the fixity. How come do you get it? You the great stasis. Okay. So everything is we know, if we look around, we think that everything is mutable. Mutable is the law of nature. So I think that way you can understand.
Thank you,
Okay.
thank you much, Atanu. It was an excellent question answer session, I must say. So thank you
I
so much
okay.
for taking the invitation and delivering such a nice talk. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Just somewhat broken versions coming in.
Thank you so much.
I also take okay. Just for a second, for some few seconds. Uh, I take the privilege of this platform to thank you again, and also the teams, those who are unseen this time, like Safi sir and Dr. Lisa ma'am. So, and the entire team, they are so collaborative, and they are for giving us the opportunity and scope, so we can relate something to the students or to the fraternity literally. So we thank you again. Okay.
Thank you so
Have
much.
a good day. Okay.
Now,
Okay.
yeah, okay. Now I invite my colleague Safi to take over. Safi, over to you.
Thank you, Anindya. A very good morning to everybody who has joined us today. It's my great privilege to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Soumya Mohan Ghosh, who is Assistant Professor of Purbasthali University, West Bengal, Purbasthali College, West Bengal, and he has done his PhD on feminist theater, and today he's going to speak on Assertion from the Margins, Articulation of Female Self in Kamla Das, and Kamla Das is an introduction. He is an erudite and accomplished scholar, and he was previously working at JRS College Jamalpur, which is uh, one of the colleges of our own very own university before he moved to West Bengal. He has published various research papers in, for example, in Asian Theatre Journal, Archive Oriental, Journal of Language, Literature and Culture, and many more. So a very warm welcome to Dr. Soumya Ghosh. It's over to you.
Thank you so much. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, you are clearly audible.
Thank you so much, sir. Um, Respected Principal, KKM College Jamui, Professor Jagrup Prasad, dear organizers, Dr. Aninda Sundar Polle and Mr. Shafi Danish from KKM College Jamui, and Dr. Lisha Sinha from English Literature Briefs, uh, my previous speaker, Mr. Atanu Kumar Paul, other dignitaries, listeners, and my dear students. A very warm welcome and a very good morning to one and all. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for providing me this opportunity to deliver this lecture today. The title of my talk is Assertion from the Margins, Articulation of Female Self in Kamala Das's An Introduction. As I was informed that this lecture is mainly meant for the undergraduate students, so I try to limit my discussion accordingly. This talk would first focus on Kamla Das's biographical sketch, and then it will be followed by the major aspects of her writing, and then it would delve deep into the poem in question, that is, an introduction, and finally, it will conclude with the mention of some materials for further study. Now, I'd like to request the admin to kindly share the slides. Can we have the slides, please?
Uh, Dr. Somo sir,
Yeah.
our admin is preparing slides. So it may take
Okay.
1 or 2 minutes. So you can introduce your topic a little bit.
Yeah. Surely. Okay. So Kamla Das is a renowned Indian poet, novelist, short story writer, essayist, and a memoirist who was born on March 31st, 1934 at Malabar, Kerala, and died on May 31st, 2009 at Pune. Her father, V.N. Nair, was a journalist, and her mother, Balamani Amma, was a distinguished Malayalam poet. She was brought up in Kerala as well as in Kolkata, and she was married off at the age of 16, at the very tender age of 16, just before her 16th birthday, with Madhav Das, who was a bank official and was almost 20 years senior to her. Kamla Das was generally held as the mother of modern Indian English poetry, and she wrote under the pen name of Madhavi Kutti. Her poetry collections include Summer in Calcutta, which was published in 1965, then The Descendants, which was published in 1967, and finally The Old Playhouse and Other Poems, which was published. Okay, we have the slides. Kindly make it full screen. The slides are not actually, yeah, it's visible right now. Okay, thank you. As I was talking about, kindly just go back to the second slide. Anyway, as I was talking about, she has published 3 volumes of poetry collection. The first one is Summer in Calcutta. The second one is The Descendants, published in 1967. And the third one is The Old Playhouse and Other Poems, which was published in 1973. And she wrote her autobiography, Ante Katha, in Malayalam and in English as My Story, which was published in 1976. As she recalled in her autobiography, My Story, she says she used to sit at night long after her husband and 3 sons had gone to sleep, writing until it was 5 and the milkman clanked at the gate with his cycle and his pails. In 1999, she took the controversial decision of converting to Islam and came to be known as Kamala Suraya. She was the recipient of many awards such as Sahitya Academy Award, Asian Poetry Prize, among the few. Next slide, please. Now we come to the major strands in Kamla Das's poetry. Das's poetry is largely autobiographical and confessional. The most distinctive feature of her poetry is the astonishing frankness with which she describes the difficulties of being a woman in a society which ostracizes women. In this context, she can be compared with Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath. Thus, very candidly talks about the traumatic experiences that she faced in her life. And according to K.R. Srinivas Iyengar, her poetry is, I quote, an attractive, protective, or defiant cover to hide the nakedness of the self, but more often than not, an engine of catharsis, a way of agonized self-knowledge. Devendra Kwali also remarked, I quote, her poetry is a compulsion neurosis. So intense is her need to find release from her emotions, unquote, that she tries to surpass all boundaries ascribed to her sex. If we read her poetry, we can find this, that she has transcended, or she has tried to transcend all boundaries that are ascribed to her sex. Even she longs for divine companionship with Lord Krishna. Her unapologetic voice is evident as she writes in the poem Loud Posture. I have stretched my two-dimensional nudity on sheets of weeklies, monthlies, quarterlies, a sad sacrifice. I have put my private voice away, adopted the typewriter's click as my only speech. Unquote. The experiences of each persona in her poems derives from her frustration in love and marriage that compels her to run from one person to another, sadly realizing that, I quote, love became a swivel door. When one went out, another came in. Next slide, please. Kamla Das, in her poetry, articulates a distinct female voice and gives expression to feminine sensibility. She revolts against the exploitation of women in the patriarchal society, thus writes about the problems of a woman writer as, I quote, a woman had to prove herself to be a good wife, a good mother, before she could become anything else. And that meant years and years of waiting. That meant waiting till the graying years. I didn't have the time to wait. I was impatient. So I started writing quite early in my life, and perhaps I was lucky. My husband appreciated the fact that I was trying to supplement the family income. So he allowed me to write at night. After all the chores were done, after I had fed the children, fed him, cleaned up the kitchen, I was allowed to sit awake and write till morning, and that affected my health. Unquote. Much of Kamla Das's works deal with the issues women face, their desire, their pain, longing, and suffering in a heterosexual relationship in which women are intricately caught up in a wave of daughter, wife, and mother. Das's poems reveal her myriad experiences of love, sex, menstruation, puberty, lust, pain, homosexual relationship, especially lesbian sensibilities, infidelity, frustration, and so on. Now, next slide, please. Kamla Das's body of writing can also be analyzed from the perspective of post-colonial feminism. Now, when I talk about post-colonial feminism, I'll just quote a prominent feminist theorist, Rajeshwari Sundararajan, who says that, I quote, post-colonial feminism cannot be regarded simply as a subset of post-colonial studies, or alternatively as another variety of feminism. Rather, it is an intervention that is changing the configurations of both post-colonial as well as feminist studies. Post-colonial feminism is an exploration of and at the intersections of colonialism and neo-colonialism, with gender, nation, class, race, and sexualities in the different contexts of women's lives, their subjectivities, work, sexuality, and rights. Similarly, Kamla Das's poetry can be situated at the crossroads of gender, nation, class, caste, and sexualities. Now, Das's attitude towards lesbianism is a bit problematic. One can find her outright rejection of lesbianism in her oft-quoted interview with P.P. Ravindran, in which she states, I quote, feminism as the Westerners see it is different from the feminism I sense within myself. Western feminism is an anti-male stance. Most of the feminists I met outside the country were lesbians, out and out lesbians. I do not think I am lesbian. I try to find out. I experiment with everything. I try to find out if I were lesbian. If I could respond to a woman, I failed. I must speak the truth. I believe we must abandon a thing if it has no moral foundation, whether it be a belief, a political system, or a religious system. However, a close reading of Das's poetry and her autobiography reveals that she is preoccupied with a search for love and pleasure, often breaking away from the heteronormative sexuality. Her work reveals the resistance of the regimes of the normal that Michael Warner, a prominent American literary critic and queer theorist, identified as the hallmark of queer writing. At times, she describes her same sex bonding before her marriage in emancipatory terms. Her sympathetic attitude towards the transgenders is evident in the poems like The Dance of the Eunuchs. Her description of the eunuchs who fall outside the heteronormative society brings out their sad plight. I'd like to quote: their voices were harsh, their songs melancholy. They sang of lovers dying and of children left unborn. Some beat their drums, others beat their sorry breasts, and wailed and writhed in vacant ecstasy. They were thin in limbs and dry, like half-burnt logs from funeral pyres. A drought and a rottenness were in each of them. Unquote. Now, her poetry has a strong note of dissent and protest against the society and culture in which women live. She rebels against the conventions and traditions of the society. In her works, poetry is a medium of protest against the societal injustices meted out to women. Her attack against her husband is also evident in the poems like The Sunshine Cat, in which she writes, I quote, being shellfish and a coward, the husband who neither loved nor used her, but was a ruthless watcher. Unquote. Her quest of identity as an Indian woman poet and an Indian English poet that I will come later when I take up the particular poem. Now, Kamla Das's uninhibited depictions of love, sex, and human anatomy have fueled the critics to label her work as obscene, strident, or even bold for its obsession with sex and for washing dirty linen in public. However, the fact that she gives expression to feminine sensibilities and female desire is largely ignored. She breaks away from the traditional Indian femininity and champions the alternate identity of Indian woman. Her poetry upholds a fearless expression of herself and celebrates her essential femininity. Next slide, please. Now we come to the poem in question, that is an introduction. In this autobiographical poem, an introduction, which is included in her poetry collection, Summer in Calcutta, she struggles to develop a sense of self which is thwarted by her own sexuality, defined and disfigured by being trapped in the maze of social institutions. The poem can be considered as a poetic expression of a woman after her initiation into the world of the adults once she gets acquainted with menstruation. It is the proclamation of a girl entering her puberty and her coming to terms with the understanding of the difference between her fanciful adolescent dreams and the stark reality of the patriarchal world full of social diktats for women. In the beginning of the poem, Das informs us that although she does not have much idea about politics, but she knows the names of those persons beginning with from Nehru, who wielded political power in the country. She says, I don't know politics, but I know the names of those in power and can repeat them like days of week or names of months, beginning with Nehru. Though apparently it seems like her ignorance, however, thus reveals what the society expects of a woman. A woman should be refrained from entering into politics, which is the domain of the men, and women should remain into the confines of their narrow domestic worlds. She continues, I am Indian, very brown, born in Malabar. I speak three languages, write in two, dream in one. Don't write in English, they said. English is not your mother tongue. Why not leave me alone, critics, friends, visiting cousins, every one of you? Why not let me speak in any language I like? Now she goes on to assert her identity as an Indian, aware of her very Indianness, very brown, born in Malabar. She also professes post-colonial sensibility in the choice of her language, like Raja Rao, who in his foreword to Kanthapura, which is normally regarded as the first major Indian novel in English published in 1938, mentions that although English is an alien language, but it can be appropriated for the purpose of the Indian writers. As Raja Rao opines that English is not, I quote, language of our emotional makeup, unquote, but is of intellectual makeup. Kamla Das sets out to express her feelings, emotions, experiences vividly through the language of the colonizer with a distinct Indian flavor marked by the rhythm, idiom, and nuances of the Indian culture. Kamla Das internalizes the question of alienation faced by her choice of writing in a non-native language and subsumes it with her own identity when she emphatically proclaims, the language I speak becomes mine. Its distortions, its queernesses, all mine, mine alone. It is half English, half Indian. Funny perhaps, but it is honest. It is as human as I am human. Don't you see? It voices my joys, my longings, my hopes, and it is useful to me as cawing is to crows or roaring to the lions. It is human speech. Next slide, please. Now, Das seems to suggest that her experiences, her longing, her desire, and her pain are felt by women across time. I quote, it may have happened to another woman who is too timid to write about it. She writes, I was child, and later they told me I grew, for I became tall. My limbs swelled, and one or two places sprouted here. When I asked for love, not knowing what else to ask, for he drew a youth of 16 into the bedroom and closed the door. He did not beat me, but my sad woman body felt so beaten. The weight of my breasts and womb crushed me. I shrank pitifully. Kamla Das shocks the orthodox mentality by narrating the onset of puberty through graphic description of human anatomy. Her poems exhibit the longing of a restless soul for love, as she was crushed by an unfulfilling marriage at a very tender age. Her life became miserable in the hands of a lustful husband, who claimed to have known the sluts and nymphomaniacs, unquote, and this prompted Kamla Das to lead, I quote, a hectic love life with small capital, just a pair of beautiful breasts and a faint musk rat smell in my perspiration, unquote. She looks for love and sex outside the bounds of marriage, often indulging in physical relationship with any man, any random man she came in contact to, all the while being neglected by her husband. She was expected to behave like a traditional wife, but she revolts. In the poem, The Old Playhouse, she writes, I quote, "You called me wife. I was taught to break saccharin into your tea and to offer at the right moment the vitamins. Cowering beneath your monstrous ego, I ate the magic loaf and became a dwarf. I lost my will and reason to all your questions. I mumbled incoherent replies. As she was agonized by the coercive marital bond and crushed by subsequent pregnancies, she revolts against the dress code sanctioned by the patriarchal society. I quote, I wore a shirt and my brother's trousers, cut my hair short, and ignored my womanliness. Her cry of revolt against the societal norms and the gender roles laid down by the society are not merely a personal protest of a lovelorn woman, but it is an expression of the subliminal desires and longings of every woman. She seems to be reiterating noted feminist critic Germaine Greed's opinion that, I quote, the female is considered a sexual object for the use of other sexual beings, that is, men. Her sexuality is denied and misunderstood as passivity, unquote. She describes the diktats given by the patriarchy as, I quote, dress in saris, be girl. Be wife, they said, be embroiderer, be cook, be a quarreler with servants. Fit in, off, belong, cried the categorizers. Don't sit on walls or peep in through our lace draped windows. Now, Michel Foucault, in his book, is a path breaking book, Discipline and Punish, talks about the ways in which the power tries to manipulate and train the human body through constant surveillance to control the individual's conduct. These surveillance methodologies are aimed at increasing the capacity of the body to escalate its productivity and its usefulness and to maintain the intended docility. Foucault says, I quote, the human body was entering a machinery of power that explores it, breaks it down, and rearranges it. Thus, discipline produces subjected and practiced bodies, what Foucault terms as docile bodies, unquote. Foucault also describes how the process of constant surveillance creates a psychological state of conscious and permanent visibility through which the individual internalizes the perpetual surveillance. And patriarchy maintains its power over the individuals through the conditioning of the girls from their very birth through some regulating processes. Here, Kamla thus breaks away from these regulatory diktats and registers her protest. Judith Butler, in her essay, Performative Acts and Gender Constitution, an essay in phenomenology and feminist theory that she published in 1988, argues that, I quote, gender identity is a performative accomplishment compelled by social sanction and taboo, unquote. She opines that gender identity is repeatedly constructed in time, starting from our childhood. Starting from the second wave feminist theories, we know that sex and gender are two different entities. One, sex is biological, but gender is a social construction. We are aware of the French feminist Simone de Beauvoir's famous claim that one is not born but rather becomes a woman. As this lecture is mostly addressed to the students, let me say a few things about the difference between sex and gender that might be helpful to our students. Once sex is biological, means we are born as male or female with different biological organs. But our society makes us to conform to the roles of a man or a woman. In our childhood, we were told by our parents that don't behave like a girl to a male child, or don't act like a boy to a female child. I think we all have experienced these. So all these roles are societal constructions that we have to obey. This conditioning that start from our childhood, from our very home, are further enforced through our educational institutions that ultimately resulted in the clear-cut gender division and gender roles. Now, Judith Butler, in her Gender Trouble, published in 1990, reiterated her views that I quote, the effect of gender is produced through the stylization of the body, as the mundane way in which bodily gestures, movements, and styles of various kinds constitute the illusion of an abiding gendered self. Butler further complicates this distinction between the sex and gender, saying that there is actually no difference between one's sex and gender. She writes, I quote, if the immutable character of sex is contested, perhaps this construct called sex is as culturally constructed as gender. Indeed, perhaps it was always already gender, with the consequence that the distinction between sex and gender turns out to be no distinction at all, unquote. The very important thing is that sex, according to Butler, she thinks that sex is always already gender. Thus, there is no difference, no seeming difference between sex and gender. For Butler, sex is not a bodily given on which the construct of gender is artificially imposed, but, I quote, a cultural norm which governs the materialization of bodies, unquote. Sex for Butler is, I quote again, an ideal construct which is forcibly materialized through time. It is not a simple fact or a static condition of a body, but a process whereby regulatory norms materialize sex and achieve this materialization through a forcible reiteration of these norms, unquote. Kamla Das reveals the attempts of the society to make her conform, to fit in to these stereotypical ways by inscribing the sex and gender on her body. Her poetry is her venture to free herself from the doctrines imposed on her. Next slide, please. She also expresses her desire to reinvent herself. She refused the imposed identity when she says, be Amy or be Kamla, or better, still be Madhvi Kutti. It is time to choose a name, a role. Don't play pretending games. Don't play at schizophrenia or be a nympho. Don't cry embarrassingly loud when jilted in love. Unquote. Women are often identified with the nature. She is the nurturer and she is expected to possess the virtues of patience and silence. She cannot cry embarrassingly. She has to suffer silently. However, she breaks away from the passive, institutionalized womanhood and tries to make herself anew. Sex for her is an eternal desire experienced by men and women, and thus she does not hesitate to go beyond the prescriptive limit assigned by the society. She writes, I quote again, I met a man, loved him, call him not by any name. He is every man who wants a woman, just as I am every woman who seeks love. In him, the hungry haste of rivers. In me, the ocean's tireless waiting. The social diktats of the man-woman relationship challenged by her is challenged by her decision. She describes the longing of both the sexes through the evocative imagery. Her search for love and sexual pleasure continues. She writes, I quote, who are you? I ask each and every one. The answer is, it is I. Anywhere and everywhere. I see the one who calls himself I in this world. He is tightly packed like the sword in its sheath. It is I who drink lonely drinks at 12 midnight in hotels of strange towns. It is I who laugh. It is I who make love and then feel shame. It is I who lie dying with a rattle in my throat. I am sinner, I am saint, I am the beloved and the betrayed. I have no joys that are not yours, no aches which are not yours. I too call myself I. The poetry of Kamla Das lays bare the innermost desires through her confessions of sexual desire, her humiliation, pain, and suffering. In the poem The Looking Glass, she says, I quote, getting a man to love you is easy. Only be honest about your wants as a woman. Stand nude before the glass with him. I'll just keep a few lines. Then she says again, gift him all, gift him what makes you woman. The scent of long hair, the mask of sweat between the breasts, the warm shock of menstrual blood, and all your endless female hungers. Oh yes, getting a man to love is easy, but living without him afterwards may have to be faced. Unquote. However, her fulfillment is accompanied with pain and betrayal. She realizes the futility of a short lived sexual encounter as she has to live without the man she has made love. She experiences the twin emotions of ecstasy and shame of having yielded to that person. She expected more than the mere physical love from the man, but each time ended up feeling frustrated. In the poem, The Freak, she delineates her expectation from a man who can go beyond satiating her physical hunger. Like, I quote again, can this man with nimble fingertips unleash nothing more alive than the skin's lazy hungers? Unquote. And in the last part of the poem, an introduction, thus description of herself evokes biblical allusion as she constructs herself as a sinner, saint, beloved, and betrayed. According to the Old Testament, woman is considered as the sinner, one who has brought death, disease, and woe in the world. She is the seductress and the temptress. However, she is also the beloved of the man, and she is a source of immense power. In case of Hindu philosophy, she is considered as Shakti, who has been invoked by poets of all ages. The universalization of women's selves transcends her poetry from the confines of the confessional bound and makes it an expression of female selves. Her poetry gives a remarkable account of herself as a sinner, saint, beloved, and betrayed, transcending the personal voice to encompass the voice of every woman. Hélène Cixous, a prominent French feminist thinker, in The Laugh of the Medusa, talks about the need to write and urge the women to use their bodies to communicate. The écriture feminine or women's writing, as propounded by the French feminists like Cizou, Irigaray, and Kristeva, professes to popularize a particular genre of literary writing which is different from the phallocentric literature, focusing on the cultural and psychological aspects of the female body and female difference in language and text. Cizou says in her essay, The Laugh of the Medusa, I quote, by writing herself, woman will return to the body which has been more than confiscated from her, which has been turned into the uncanny stranger on display, the ailing or dead figure, which is so often turns out to be the nasty companion, the cause and location of inhibitions. Censor the body and you censor breath and speech at the same time. She continues, write yourself, your body must be heard. Only then will the immense resources of the unconscious spring forth. Unquote. Women are generally constructed as the other to men. Their desire, their longing are largely ignored. Their sexual pleasure has mostly been repressed and denied expression by the dominant patriarchal discourse, which considers women as passive in contrast to the men who are valorized as active. Cizou further exclaims, I quote, we have been turned away from our bodies, shamefully taught to ignore them, to strike them with that stupid sexual modesty. We have been victims of the old fool's game. Each one will love the other sex. I will give you your body and you will give me mine. Unquote. Mark the words. To strike them with that stupid sexual modesty. Women are thought to be modest. Women are expected to be modest. These are all deconstructed by Kamla Das in her poems. Writing for Kamla Das is a mode of resistance to the social ostracization and a process of articulation of her female self through her writing. The kaleidoscopic images of women as presented by Das shows its realism. Das presents women in many of her roles as girl, woman, daughter, wife, mother, lovelorn, ecstatic, despairing, and so on. Women of flesh and blood become alive in her work. In her collection of poems, The Descendants, she writes, I quote again, we are all alike, we women in our wrappings of hairless skin, unquote. Thus, to conclude, we can say that Kamla Das achieves an absolute rebellious dimension in her poetry by pondering over the issues of women's status in the society, their desire for love, sex, their suffering, and despair. In the poem and introduction, she presents a new self-definition, breaking away from the patriarchal construction of herself. She proclaims her subjectivity, going out of the mere status of an object in the patriarchal society. Through the use of the personal pronoun I that we can find in the course of the poem, the poet reveals her own existence by giving expression to her personal experiences and wants to break the boundaries of tradition in a subjective manner. From her poems, she contests the fluid category of gender identity and desires to construct an alternate identity of the woman. Her poetry signals the advent of Indo-Anglican poetry, as well as Indo-Anglican women's poetry as well, and the proliferation of women's voices in recent times can be traced back to the poetry of Kamla Das. Now, next slide, please. For further study, I listed some books which may be helpful to the students. First is Subhash Chandra Saha's book on modern Indo-Anglican poetry that talks about major themes in Kamla Das's poems. Then K.R. Srinivas Iyengar's chapter on the new poets in his book Indian Writing in English, which is also worth reading. Devendra Kohli's book Kamla Das deals with Das's poetic career and her poems, which is a remarkable study. Anisur Rahman's book Expressive Form in the Poetry of Kamla Das also deserves merit, like in Vedi's book Kamla Das and Her Poetry. Center for Research in the New Literatures in English, Australia's series on Kamla Das, a selection with essays on her work edited by S.C. Harrex and Vincent O'Sullivan, is also a very remarkable work on the late poet. Other notable works or books are Brinda Nabar's Endless Female Hunger, a study of Kamla Das, and Kamla Das, the Poetic Pilgrimage by Irshad Ghulam Ahmed, etc. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Soumya, for that remarkably comprehensive introduction to Kamla Das's poetry. And I don't really know what to say because I'm not a scholar. I mean, we have read some poetry of Kamla Das, but it's generally what you would encounter during your course. All I can say is that yesterday we had a lecture on Torudat, and
Yeah.
I couldn't help but and I was telling the speaker yesterday that one couldn't help but notice that in Torudat's poetry there is a lot of influence of romantic poets that you can
Yes,
clearly
yes.
discern. You can see that she has consciously modeled her poetry on romantic poets. And what a remarkable departure Kamla Das's poetry is from something like that. You could hear clearly her individual self. In fact, the entire lyricism of her poetry comes from her expression of herself and how well and how passionately she does that. But even then, I mean, uh, is all of it is even when she's expressing herself, when she is expressing her views on the general constraints that women face uh, when they try to come out of gender normative roles in India. Is it all her, or is there some amount of, uh, I should say, a conformism to certain trends or certain ideas in the society, even in Kamla Das, is a question that came into my mind because uh, especially when you read her lines on politics, when she talks about the fact that women are not supposed to be in politics, and then she can recite their names beginning with Nehru. She's almost dismissive about the entire. She's almost dismissive about the prospect of a woman being in that. Okay, that is something that is almost impossible. But we know for a fact that that is not the case. I mean, if we look at how things are today, and in fact, I would say that the privilege of entering politics has always been available to a certain class of people. Uh, Perhaps not quite as much as to a man, but that privilege has never been entirely closed to a certain class of women. And I wonder whether Kamla Das, when she expressed her view, was just following a certain idea of what women can and cannot do that was available to her, or whether this was her own views. And that is something that I would love it if you'd comment sometime later, after you have dealt with some of the other questions that I'm sure are there. And there are many
Actually,
other
just I want to mention one thing, that Kamla Das herself in her later years participated in the election, but she
oh,
failed.
okay. Okay. Okay, so that's very interesting.
Yes, yes, that's
Also,
there.
you mentioned Helen Sizu, and I mean, I must quite frankly say that I've had a lot of problems with Helen Sizu, especially with the laugh of the Medusa, because it seemed to me when I read her essay, and it's been quite a long time, but that she, like many other French writers, blurs the distinction between metaphor and reality. What one might understand metaphorically, and what, for example, her prescription for writing, for women to write their body. If I'm not wrong, she talks about the rhythm of women writing possessing the rhythm of labor pains. That's that
Yeah, yeah,
is that may be that's a metaphorical, that may be a metaphorical understanding of writing, but that can
yeah.
never be
She,
something that is actually. But that distinction, that what she's saying is it should be taken metaphorically, is never there. And in fact, much of the power of her writing, Sizu's writing, depends on that blurring of that distinction, as does, I mean, at least that has been my feeling, that of many of the French critics, not just Sizu, but many other French critics, they blurred that distinction, and
they actually
therefore,
equated writing from the body, the bodily experiences that women have. And she explicitly tells that write yourself, write your bodies need to be heard.
yes, and the rhythm
But
should be that of labor
yeah, yeah,
pains.
yeah. Those things are there, obviously.
Exactly, and similarly, I mean, if you we were talking about Derrida in one of our earlier lectures, and with Derrida too, there is the similar problem, as many critics have pointed out, that what we might say about language in the absolute, it translates as being very literal, in a very literal manner, and thus creating a straw man. But I'm going way off topic here, and so therefore I'd come back and I'd ask Anindya uh, to start the question answer session.
Okay. First question is, Kamla Das's poems are centered around her own self, probing the malaise and morbidity that seem to clamp on her poetic vision. What's your take on this? Probing the malaise and morbidity? Yes, in the course of my lecture, I talked about this, and the very fact that her poems are autobiographical and confessional. So she is confessing her own desires, and she is talking about the problems she has faced, the malaise, the morbidity, and the fact that she was married off at a very tender age, when she actually uh, was not in a stage to embrace the marriage. And so she experienced those things, and at the hands of her very lustful husband. So these things she has repeatedly mentioned in course of her poems, as well as in her autobiography My Story, where she graphically describes, even in one instance, she describes that her husband is enjoying the company of another man, and Kamla Das was waiting, but she came back to her own room, and she experiences a kind of vacant, a kind of uh, loneliness that she tells in her uh, autobiography. So these things are there. She talks about her own personal experiences that she has faced. Thank you. Yeah, Devashish Mitra. Do you think her lesbian sensibility is more of radical sort of feminist stance? Is she like a gynocritic rereading her mind and body? Did her homosexuality result from her frustrated straight sex? Thank you for this question, this cluster of question, I should say. First part, do you think her lesbian sensibility is more of a radical sort of feminist stance? See, in my course of talk, I have discussed her attitude towards lesbianism, which is a bit problematic. Once she says that she actually dismisses lesbianism, and in one of her poems also she says that uh, she has lost one of her friends, and the lesbians hiss their love. So mark the word hiss. It's a very derogatory word, and though Kamla Das talks about lesbianism in such a derogatory manner, but if you read her autobiography, My Story, you can find out uh, her lesbian encounter before her marriage. So it's a kind of problematic. You can say that this is a kind of radical thinking on her part. Is she like a gynocritic rereading her mind and body? Uh, Maybe you can tell that she is rereading her mind and body, and actually she is the body of her writing delineates her longing for love and sexual pleasure, and she tries to find this love through her marital relationship with her husband, but she miserably fails, and that prompts her to go outside the bounds of marriage, go outside the bounds of marital bond, and she uh, experiences many sexual encounters with random men. Even at times, she has forgiven her rapists as well. So, this heterosexual relationship might seem to her as problematic, as hierarchical. So, in her poetry, in her body of literature, she tries to move out from the bounds of heteronormative sexuality, and in her life as well, and that she tries to experience in the interview that I quoted. She clearly states that she tried to experience that if she was a lesbian, if she has some lesbian sensibility, maybe this is because of the frustrations that she had, because she longed for love and sexual pleasure, but she uh, failed in her desire. So that prompted her to experiment, that prompted her to go beyond the heterosexual norm. Thank you. I suppose this answers this question. Next is by Kundan Thakur. My question is there Kamla Das as sensual and confessional poetry in which type of gender perspective, sir? The Kamla Das as sensual and confessional poetry in which type of gender perspective? I could not get your question, I suppose, but I suppose you are trying to ask that her sensual and confessional poetry uh, in which type of gender perspective? Means she talks about from the perspective of a woman. She talks about the experiences of a woman, of a woman's self. So from that perspective, she um, talks about her sensual journey, and she confesses in the mm, sheets, in the papers, that is through her poems. Do you think her unleashing of her innermost pangs of guilt, misery, fears, doubts, and anxieties to reinstate her experience as woman help her acquire autonomy over her being and discover her true self, I suppose? Yes, obviously, she tries to experiment, and she tries to get the pleasure, get the sexual pleasure from the bounds of, from outside the bounds of her marriage. But there also she finds this sense of guilt. She explicitly tells, I am sinner, I am saint. Sometimes she, after the sexual act gets over, she considers herself as the sinner, thinking about the fact that uh, though she has enjoyed the moment, but she has to leave. She has to leave the man and leave live, live without that person. So these anxieties are there, and the fact that she was crushed by her uh, femininity through her early marriage and subsequent pregnancies. She tried to acquire the autonomy. She tried to um, get the subjective position instead of just merely becoming an object in a patriarchal society. She tries to make herself the subject. The subjectivity is very much important, and throughout her life, she actually tried to experiment. And in 1999, she actually converted to Islam. That is also a kind of experiment on her part to get. Yeah, sorry, please. You can. How can you compare Kamla Das with other confessional poets like Anne Sexton and or Sylvia Plath? Thank you for this question. Anne Sexton and uh, Sylvia Plath and Kamla Das were um, almost contemporaries. Kamla Das was born in 1934. Anne Sexton was born in 1928, and Sylvia Plath was born on 1932. So more or less, these poets were contemporaries. And Sylvia Plath and Kamla Das were raised, and these poets were raised in totally different milieus, separated by a large geographical space. But we can find similar kinds of themes and similar kind of treatments in their works. Both these writers were bold, and they revolted and expressed their frustrations, their loneliness through their medium of poetry. And Sylvia Plath, the themes which are addressed by Sylvia Plath are very broad, that ranges from the her um, uh, schizophrenia and her father fixation, and her husband's affairs, multiple affairs with other women, her suicidal thoughts, her suicidal tendencies, all are poured into her works. And in case of Anne Sexton also, Anne Sexton was actually suffering from severe bipolar disorder, and she had acute depression, suicidal tendencies, and crushed by her unhappy relationship with her husband. So thematically, she also wrote in similar tone. She also talks about menstruation, puberty, adultery, incest, and masturbation, as Kamla Das talks about in her poetry. So, in this way, there are similarities in case of Kamla Das and Sexton or Sylvia Plath. Both these poets are confessional, and you can find uh, distinct autobiographical tone in her poems, and there are similarities in case of thematic aspects as well. So in these ways, these poets have almost talked about similar things. I think, yeah. Is thus caught up within the duality of homo-hetero space, or did she attempt to acquire a kind of third space for the expression of her sexuality to debunk the fixity of sex, gender, desire teleology? Thank you for this question. I agree with you that she actually attempted to a kind of third space to express her sexuality and debunk the fixity of the sex, gender, desire teleology. She experimented with different forms. She experimented with different people and outside the marriage, within the bounds of marriage, but she failed. Each time she failed, and she faced a kind of guilt. She considers herself a sinner. So and she has also experienced homosexual relationships as well. So throughout her life, she actually tried to move out from these homo-heterosexual relationships and tried to embrace a third space. But I don't know, maybe her desire, her longing, whether materialized or not, that really is a question.
Thank you, Soumya. I think that was the last question.
Okay.
Thank you for a very interesting session, very comprehensive, and you have.
Thank you so much, and I'd like to thank the organizers once again, Dr. Polle, Dr. Sinha, and you, and all the team behind this successful organization of this week-long lecture series. I hope that
Well, it was
would be.
great to have you. It was great to have you. I
Oh,
wish at various points during the course of these lectures, I have wished that we could have had a more extended session in which we could have had a more extended discussion on various topics that come up during the course of the lecture. And I think that
thank
itself
you so much.
is a testament to the success of the lecture, that it brings out that kind of desire, that you want to talk more about it because it has been such an interesting lecture. So I thank you
Thank you
for
so
that.
much.
And I think the only thing left is for me to announce the speakers for tomorrow.
Yeah,
The first one would be Mr. Priya Ranjan Tiwari. I'm sure you're familiar with him. He's assistant professor
yeah,
at Koshi College in Khagadia, Munger University. Tomorrow he would be speaking about the significance of nature in Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. And he would be speaking at 10:30. At 11:30, we would be joined by Miss Kavita Rajamoni. She's assistant professor of Stella Maris College in Chennai, and
Chennai.
her
Yeah,
topic is William Wordsworth, the poet of the common man. Thank you once again, Soumya. A good day to you and to everyone who has joined us.
thank you.
See
A
you
good
tomorrow.
day.